Welcome to the Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thanks for being with us. The 2026 Winter Olympics are well underway in Milan and Cortina, bringing the Games back to Italy for the first time since 2006. The theme of this year's opening ceremony was harmony, or armonia in Italian, a message of unity on a global stage. But as American athletes chase medals abroad, the political climate at home is anything but harmonious, with an ongoing partial government shutdown and mass deportation efforts dividing the country as President Trump has just completed his first year back in office. Some American athletes competing in these Winter Games have acknowledged the complicated emotions they're navigating while representing the United States. Freestyle skier Chris Lillis said he feels heartbroken about what's happening in the U.S. His teammate, Hunter Hess, said representing the U.S., quote, brings up mixed emotions and that it's, quote, a little hard. President Trump responded on Truth Social, calling Hess a real loser. In the days that followed, additional Team USA athletes came to Hess's defense. And beyond the U.S., global conflicts continue to unfold. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has entered its fourth year. Fighting continues in Gaza despite a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. And in Sudan, a devastating civil war has created one of the world's worst humanitarian crises to date. Today, we explore the intersection of politics and the Olympics. The International Olympic Committee, or IOC, maintains a firm stance against the politicization of sport. But have the Games ever truly been apolitical? Today, we'll have experts weigh in. Joining us for this conversation, we have Dr. Leslie Heafy, Associate Professor of Sports History at Kent State University. Dr. Heafy, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
We also have joining us by phone Dr. Catherine Lavelle, Professor in World Affairs at Case Western Reserve University. Hi, Dr. Lavelle.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. We'd love for you to join the conversation. You can give us a call at 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org or send us a message on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. Leslie, when we look at the headlines that we're seeing today, is this something new, the entrance of politics into the Olympic sports, or are we just seeing a faster and louder version of old patterns?
So it's a great question. It's the one that everybody has in mind. And of course, the answer historically is no, this is not new. It's been true since almost the very beginnings of the modern day Olympics that there have been opportunities for athletes to express their views on things that are happening in the world. I mean, it goes all the way back to 1906 when we have an Irish athlete who decides to use the Irish flag instead of the British flag in protest of what was happening at the world at the time. And it comes right up to the present day. And so despite the larger efforts, this is not new. And the reactions have always been mixed as they are now.
Katie, before we get further into this conversation, let's define the terms that we're talking about here. When we say the Olympics are political, have been political historically, despite the IOC's preference that they not be, what do we actually mean? We're talking about state power, diplomacy, human rights, athlete activism.
Well, there's so much politics that we're baked in, and as Leslie pointed out, they go so far back in Olympic history. One of the original ideals behind the Olympic movement in the late 1800s was connected to this rising nationalist movement in Europe. And the idea was to try to channel it in a positive or a nonviolent way, where all of the athletes would come, and some saw them as ambassadors of peace. But the problem is that even from the beginning, the contradiction is baked in that they are participating in opening ceremonies where they walk in with their flag and they are there as part of the people of the country, representing them in a team mentality, but really drawing on these nationalist sentiments. So I think the terms that we're talking about here have to do with the broader nationalist ideas, and then some of the more specific bans that we're talking about right now in terms of political speech. Those bans came later in the history of the Olympics, but that is connected to specific things about politics that athletes say. So you have the political issue of what the athletes can say, but also which countries are invited and which countries don't want to come. So those terms would be obviously the ban would be countries that are not welcome, and the boycott would be countries that choose not to go by their own volition.
And Katie, you mentioned people walking in under their flag, those opening ceremonies, which can be looked at as cultural celebrations, but also political messaging. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, sure. It's political messaging because one of the things we love about the Olympics is that we can all maybe not see ourselves as athletes, but we can see ourselves as part of this bigger family of people that represent the nation and try to get away from that government aspect. But at the same time, it's a great stage. It's a great platform. So when the Olympics introduced these speech bans, the political speech bans specifically are against the opening ceremonies, the closing ceremonies, the medal ceremonies, and what athletes can say when they're on the or communicate when they're on the playing field. So I think in later years, organizers are very aware of the attention that the games draw and the goodwill, but people also wanting to use them as a platform to express their views about politics.
Leslie, one of the most cited examples of political spectacle is the 1936 Berlin Olympics. What made those games so politically significant?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons to think about when you think about 1936. And as was just pointed out, it's about the context of the time period. And so, countries bid to be selected for the Olympic hosts, and Germany very particularly chose that Olympics because they were already under fire for things and questions about what was happening in the country. And so it was an attempt in part to try to show the world that a better image than what people had of Germany at the time. And so that's where it all kind of starts, is just with that whole approach that this was going to be a chance for them to show the world that Germany wasn't what people were saying and things weren't happening the way people expected. And then, of course, once the games start, the most famous incidents that we see are with Jesse Owens and other of our both Jewish and black athletes not receiving their medals, not getting the attention from Hitler, et cetera. And so you've got that aspect of what is happening in the 36 Olympics. And that's what people remember today, is the representation of all of those things that are happening in the world sort of coming center stage, because after all, the attention of the world is on the Olympics.
And Leslie, to stay with you for a moment on this, decades later in the 1968 Summer Olympics, that's where we see Tommy Smith and John Carlos raising their fists in a Black Power salute. And beyond these iconic moments, what other examples stand out of athletes using the games as a platform to protest?
So it's long happened. So even in the same 1968 Olympics, most people remember Tommy Smith and John Carlos for their salute, but Peter Norman was obviously on the podium with them as well, and he stood in solidarity with them. He was wearing the badge for the Olympic Project for Human Rights, which is what was behind that particular original thought, was to boycott those Olympics. In that same Olympics, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar chose not to participate in the basketball. Instead of, as Smith and Carlos did, they used the podium and thought that was, I mentioned, in 1906, the Irish athlete Peter O'Connor, Irish athlete, protesting the British, and he decides to wave an Irish flag instead of the British flag. Some may remember Kathy Freeman in 2000 in Sydney. She's an Indigenous Brit, and so she chose to celebrate by carrying both the Australian and Aboriginal flags. And there are lots of other examples that you can look to across but those are just a few that come to mind. That we, even most recently, you had the athlete, the athlete who was not allowed to wear his helmet with the individuals who died in the Ukrainian conflict. And so lots and lots of examples over the course of the Olympics, simply because, as was pointed out, it's a world stage, and you've got national anthems being played, you've got flags from the countries being represented, and so opportunities for these kinds of things have occurred.
We have a couple callers now who have some thoughts they'd like to share on moments of protests that have come up at the Olympics. David from Cleveland Heights is calling in. David, welcome to the Sound of Ideas. Go ahead.
Yes. Oh, great show as usual. My main comment was also about the Ukrainian athlete who was trying to commemorate people who died because of the Russian invasion, but comparing it to our Star Spangled Banner, which is commemorating our winning a war. But also I have the history of my mother, who was born in Berlin and had to escape Nazi Germany, but she talked about going to the Berlin Olympic Stadium with her father when she was little, and talked about how that related to Jesse Owens and everything. So, anyway, go women's U.S. hockey.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Thank you very much, David. Women's U.S. hockey definitely making a showing at this Olympics. We appreciate you calling in and sharing that perspective and your family history related to that. We also have another call from Thomas in Parma Heights. Thomas, welcome to the Sound of Ideas. Go ahead.
Good morning. You just spoke of the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, but I was traveling in Mexico after that, and there was a Mexican army base in Acapulco, and the Mexican guys were playing a pickup game of basketball, the soldiers. But it should be mentioned that before those Olympics, there was a massacre of protesters by the Mexican army, and these protesters were trying to protest the Olympics that were coming up, and many people were massacred. And does anyone there remember that?
Thank you for sharing that with us, Thomas in Parma Heights. We appreciate you calling into the Sound of Ideas. If you're just joining us, we are talking about politics and the intersection of politics and the Olympics, moments that have been used as protest by athletes, and how politicization, despite the preferences of the International Olympic Committee, do seem to make their way into the Olympics. If you want to call in to share a comment or a question, that number is 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org. Katie, let's talk about opening day in Milan at this 2026 Olympics. There were protests erupting over the presence of U.S. immigration and customs enforcement agents. Italian officials say ICE would not have an operational role, and Milan's mayor said they were not welcome. U.S. officials said that ICE was there to monitor transnational criminal organizations. So, Katie, let me ask you, under what legal framework do foreign security forces operate during the Olympics? Is this something that's standard international cooperation, or does that blur the lines of national sovereignty?
Well, again, remember that there is an unfortunate history here with respect to security at the Olympics. And here we have to turn to the 1972 Munich Games, where the terrorist attack on Israeli athletes resulted in the death of 11 Israelis. And I think after that time, countries were concerned about sending their athletes to the Olympics for obvious reasons, that these political connections are very well known, and we want to keep the events violence free. So since that time, the provisions that have been put into place have reassured countries and have allowed for the games to continue. But in our own context, we are unfortunately embroiled in this debate about how we want to enforce our laws and which agencies should enforce our laws. My understanding is in the past, the representation of these particular ICE, Customs and Border Enforcement has not been an issue. But remember, the Department of Homeland Security was formed relatively recently in American history and in Olympic history. So I think that people try to seize on what they can, because we're back to the issue of the stage, that this is a stage where you can make a protest that's going to be heard around the world.
We have an email now in from Jason. Jason writes, can your guests speak on the Ukrainian skeleton racer being disqualified, which is what we mentioned earlier with the depictions of the people who had died in Ukraine on the helmet? Can we speak about the Ukrainian skeleton racer being disqualified, yet the Israeli two-man bobsled racer being allowed to compete? Jason writes, seems like the IOC picks and chooses how rules are applied. And Katie, I'd like to talk to you about this when it comes to the criteria when banning a country or banning competitors.
Yeah, well, I think Leslie made a great point earlier that the games operate in a context of the world that we live in. And if we go back in time, remember, people didn't want to compete with athletes who were from a different social class. They certainly didn't want to compete with athletes who were from a different race. Unfortunately, that aspect of nationalism has been a thread through the history of the Olympics. But also, people didn't have plans for women competing. So it was a great comment about women's hockey, because the introduction of women into the Olympic Games, I think most of us celebrate. So when we think about what one country or another country perceives as a legitimate representation of political speech, we are going to get into these issues that pull on the conflicts that are out there. Now, the International Olympic Committee's defense of all of this is that there's 130 conflicts going on in the world right now, and they don't want to have 130 different medals and representations and things going on that are going to take away from the athleticism of the games. But I think for many of us looking on from the outside, there does seem to be individual instances where it's difficult to understand why the committee makes the decisions that it does.
Let's talk about some of those decisions that have been made. Russia and Belarus are banned from the 2026 Winter Olympics. Athletes from those areas are competing as individual neutral athletes. So the athletes themselves not necessarily banned, but the representation of the country. And there are continuing restrictions from Paris of 2024 for Russia and Belarus specifically. Now, historically, countries banned before include Germany and Japan after World War II, South Africa during apartheid, and Afghanistan under Taliban restrictions in 2000. So when we look at these standards and whether or not they've been applied consistently, Katie, do you have thoughts on why Israel was not banned from this year's Olympics?
I've got to admit, I don't have any kind of specific information on that particular decision. Sorry.
That's okay. Just bringing up the historical context there, and we appreciate you answering candidly there. We want to remind our audience we are talking about the intersection of politics and the Olympics. If you want to call in with a question or a comment, the number is 866-578-0903, and you can email us at soi@ideastream.org. Leslie, why does the International Olympic Committee maintain a strong stance against politics in sports, even going so far as to minimize the coverage of protests on and near Olympic events?
Well, I think it's been mentioned already in part. You have to understand the history sort of the games, and yes, they came to fruition in a time period of heightened nationalism and all the things that were happening at the turn of the last 19th century into the 20th century. But even with that being said, from the beginning, the intent, and I think you saw it in the theme of this year's opening ceremony, right? The idea that this was an opportunity to take something that was happening that had the potential to be taken to a violent level, nationalism resulting in conflicts of violence, and turning that into an opportunity to say, but can't we come together and celebrate as a world in a way that is peaceful, that is harmonious, and so that effort to try to constantly maintain that, and it's been challenged, obviously, right from the very beginning, but there's always been this sense that this is an opportunity to take a different look at the world and to allow the world to maybe step back from some of these conflicts and try to turn this into something positive. And so, as a consequence, rightly, wrongly, unfairly, sometimes maybe expressed, they have tried to maintain that sense that that is what the Olympics are for, and that this is there for an opportunity to celebrate with these athletes who have put so much effort into being there and not taking away from allowing them to celebrate in positive ways. And so I think it's that effort to try to put that positive message out into the world that has led to them creating Rule 50, which is one of the pieces that governs what the athletes can and cannot do and things like that. It's rooted in its history, and it's the success of it, we can see over the course of history, but I think that's the attempt that's being made.
Leslie, thank you for bringing up Rule 50. Katie, I want to ask you a procedural question about that as we read an email from Jody. Jody writes in, as usual, the Olympic Committee is audaciously hypocritical. They banned Russian athletes competing under the flag, yet deny someone who is actually affected by that unlawful invasion from competing for acknowledging the deaths of his fellow citizens. Jody, thank you for writing in. Jody is referring to the Ukrainian skeleton racer who was disqualified there. So, Katie, when it comes to enforcing Rule 50 from the International Olympic Committee, Rule 50 restricts political demonstrations on the field of play and the medal podium. Who decides what's political? And do you have any idea, can you give us any kind of insight into how that's being determined?
Well, my understanding is in recent years, these decisions are being sent to the International Court of Arbitration for Sport. And so that is a different body that was established to resolve a variety of issues that come up with respect to sport, including the doping scandals. So again, maybe Leslie knows more about that. But the problem with any international court of arbitration has to be with how the cases are brought and also the timeline. So many times the decisions that come out are so much later that when a medal is awarded or we get the ultimate conclusion, people have long since stopped paying attention. So, on behalf of the skeleton racer who was disqualified, if he intended to bring attention to the cause or not, he may have actually achieved his goal because so many of us are thinking about it and talking about it and having to defend our views on that particular conflict to our friends and people that we encounter simply because he was courageous enough to remember his friends in that way, whether or not he intended it to be political.
Let's talk about the cost of the Olympics and what countries have to gain there. Leslie, the 2014 Winter Games reportedly cost more than $50 billion, making them the most expensive Winter Olympics at the time. Why are the Games so expensive and who benefits?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think the games are in part so expensive simply because, first and foremost, just the huge rise in the number of athletes that are participating, the number of countries that are present, and the requirements necessary to provide the venues at the level that are necessary for the quality of sport that you're going to see. But so you're thinking about venues, right? And that's why, for example, even this year's Olympics taking place in multiple places simply because of the sheer requirements. Add to that then the cost of the rest of the infrastructure. So yeah, it's building all of those venues, but then you've got all of the providing for all of the people who come to stay for weeks, not just the athletes, their families, the fans, right? So lots of infrastructure that has to get built around that. And the assumption, of course, is partly that that's where you're going to make back your money, right? Is on the sheer volume of people that are attending and then on the media side of things. But there's a huge cost in putting together all of that media and the credentials and the infrastructure for all of that. And then security, et cetera. And suddenly the costs start. And so I think a lot of times countries bid for it with the thought that this is going to be something that is going to make them money. Ultimately, generally does not. But they're also thinking about it from the standpoint of goodwill, the prestige that comes with being the one chosen, the opportunity to showcase your country, your history, your athletes. We know that typically there's there's that home field advantage, and so we see often a little bump in medal winning by the country that hosts, and so there's a certain amount of pride attached to that. But I don't think that necessarily they think through and understand the costs versus the benefits, or maybe they do, and it's still this sense of the prestige that comes with it, the pride, all of those kinds of things outweigh the potential cost factor.
Katie, let's talk about the cost of the Olympics and the hoped for or anticipated outcome in light of the 2014 Winter Olympics. So, shortly before those Olympics in Sochi, Russia passed its so called gay propaganda law, and there was a lot of criticism about that. What were President Vladimir Putin's goals in hosting those games? And how did that ultimately impact the country's image? Did it have a lasting effect?
Well, I think again, the whole question of being chosen, and particularly with the Winter Games, a different kind of sport, and also I don't, just more expensive to attend because of the fewer number of venues where they can be held. So I believe Sochi was the first time that the games had returned after the Moscow Games, and so it was a pretty big deal to have the Olympic Games back, and the passage of the anti-LGBTQ legislation certainly aroused a lot of political speech before and during. Once again, though, I think a lot of the athletes chose to use the opportunity for political speech outside of the prescripted areas, just so that they could make a point about the importance of including openly LGBTQ athletes in the games. And I'm not sure that Putin got out of it what he tried to do when he passed that legislation, because it certainly made it onto the news, and the whole idea that this wasn't something that was long-standing, that it seemed very vindictive that he did it right before the games in order to make his point. I think the athletes and their supporters in return wanted to make their point back, that putting these things on the stage can sometimes have an effect that you don't count on.
Katie brought up their athletes choosing to make their points outside of the prescripted areas. You can't make it on the field of play, you can't make a political statement on the podium. Leslie, I want to ask you, how has social media played into this? Has that weakened the IOC's ability to control what athletes are saying from a political perspective throughout the Olympics?
I would say yes, because again, the rules are pretty clear on where they can't make statements, and those are the most public venues, right? Those are the playing field, those are the podium, those kind of opening and closing ceremonies and things. But it also says that they can voice their opinions, right, in their interviews and things like that, because they make clear distinction between opinions and protests, right? And so one would argue that on social media, those are people offering their opinions, and therefore those are outside the venue. And that was one of the issues with one of the Israeli athletes in the discussion, was that he had made comments on social media, and therefore that should be counted against him, right? But that's that's a tough thing to arbitrate and to think about, simply because those are outside those venues that are being prescripted by Rule 50. And so therefore, and social media is individual people voicing their opinions. And that is one of the areas where that is supposed to be allowed, as long as it's not turning into protests. And so trying to make that clear distinction between people voicing an opinion and leading a protest.
So when we talk about these athletes, Katie, I'll ask this question first to you and then to Leslie. Athletes do occupy a uniquely visible platform, but they're not elected officials, they're not policy experts, they're not paid by the government. Should athletes be asked for political opinions, or is that an unfair burden we're placing on them? Katie, I'll ask you first.
Yeah, they are still citizens in a democracy, and in the democracy we live in, at least, there's still free speech rights. And one of the things I think we celebrate as Americans is that athletes can speak freely. So there's certainly examples of athletes in other countries who cannot criticize their own government. And so this is something that's part of who we are. And if we are celebrating nationalism and representing our country, that's going to be a part of what we're representing. So I think stripping athletes or trying to completely take politics out of the Olympics is impossible, because as we said, it's certainly been a way of channeling politics going back to the founding of the modern Olympic movement. So I wouldn't put too much of a burden on the athletes to go out and say what we want, or to hear whatever we want to hear from them. But I also, if they want to speak up and they're asked about it, it's certainly their right as American citizens to do that.
What do you think about that, Leslie?
I would totally agree. It is part of who we are in this particular case in the United States. And if this is who we are, and this is what we celebrate, then that comes with the good and the bad. And people are going to be and should be allowed to voice their thoughts and their opinions. As you pointed out, they are not speaking on behalf of, they are speaking as individuals. And that's a huge difference. They're not being asked to speak on behalf of the government or on behalf of an elected official. And that's the difference from our country to others that don't have that opportunity because of the rules of their own countries that don't allow them. That is part of the whole experience. They are there as citizens of this country, and others are citizens of their countries, and they are operating under those rules. And so free speech is something that we protect and value, and so that is what they are doing.
Katie, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, commented on comments that were made by Team USA athlete Hunter Hess. Is that something we've seen before, presidents commenting in such a way about political expression by athletes?
Well, unfortunately, everything gets dragged into partisan politics in this country. You know, when Leslie was talking, I was thinking it's a little bit refreshing not to be so concerned about how much money. I think some of these athletes, particularly when President Trump comes down on them, they're really risking endorsements and how wide their appeal might be when they get out, which is usually something that we don't like to see, the commercial side of the Olympics. So there have been some athletes who've been criticized. Obviously, the I guess we'd say Chinese American skier Eileen Zhou, I believe, who is competing for China and is receiving so much money from the Chinese government. I haven't heard President Trump weigh in on that, but it's very difficult when the president weighs in on these individual comments, because usually the office of the presidency is one where you would want to be above the fray on those issues. But in the times we live in, certainly we're back to context, the times we live in, the president feels free to weigh in on any issue that he sees appropriate. And, as any other citizen in the democracy, that's his right to do.
Leslie, we've seen politics appearing not necessarily just through protest or for affirmative actions or steps or words, but also through absence. The U.S. led a boycott of the 1980 Summer Olympics over the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and then the Soviet Union retaliated by boycotting the 1984 Summer Olympics. Do we think that this has an impact, this has an effect, or is this something that just results in punishing athletes? Leslie, I'll ask you first.
So I think it's a twofold answer. It definitely obviously hurts the athletes. And I think that's sometimes the reaction that has come to say how unfair that is, that they have put together and they don't get it. And some of them may never get another opportunity, right? It's not like it's every year or anything like that. And so from that standpoint, there certainly is an effect on the athletes that can't be denied. At the same time, the idea of, again, you've got a world stage on which you are making a point. And so you could argue that that was the intent in both cases. The United States, in an attempt to bring attention to what they saw as some of the issues and problems, and this was their way of saying they weren't going to support it. How much of an effect did it have in causing change? That's always a harder thing to, and as a historian, that cause and effect directly is always hard to find. But it certainly drew attention, as was pointed out by Kathy earlier, the idea that whether it's comments that are being made, a protest, a boycott, at least for a short period of time, and our attention span isn't always as long as we would like, it draws attention to, and it draws people's attention to something that they might otherwise not have thought about. And so from that standpoint, it certainly brings attention to something, but there's no denying, of course, the effect that it has on the athletes themselves.
Mm-hmm. Final question here to Katie before we wrap up. Is silence itself now interpreted as a political statement?
Silence on who? On the part of the international athletes, or?
Yes, on the part of the international athletes, kind of as a segue from the boycotting. You know, there's boycotting where an entire country chooses not to show up, but there's also an athlete just choosing not to speak on a topic.
Right. But like I said, sometimes you don't know if they're just doing it because they're looking to the future and they're thinking about the commercial value that their victory might have. Some of these things, when you stretch them out over a longer timeline, also look a little bit different. So, when you were asking the question about the boycotts, President Carter was heavily criticized at the time because, like Leslie pointed out, it did hurt the athletes and it was a once in a lifetime opportunity. But then when we stretch it out over the long term and the Cold War history, I think when President Carter died recently, there was a sense that we hadn't intervened militarily. We did that because of the invasion of Afghanistan. And President Carter looked at it as a way to make a statement without it being a military statement. And for people who have political concerns now about the rise of military intervention around the world, that decision might be reevaluated in terms of how wise it was. I think it's still tough on the athletes, without a doubt, but for the country as a whole, we are revisiting and rethinking what type of a role we want to play in the world with respect to our military going forward. That is still very important.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this conversation today. I want to thank our guests for being here. Dr. Leslie Heafy, Associate Professor of Sports History at Kent State University. Thanks for being a part of the conversation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity and enjoyed the conversation very much.
And Dr. Catherine Lavelle, Professor in World Affairs at Case Western Reserve University. Dr. Lavelle, thank you for calling in today.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed the conversation as well.
We'll take a quick break now. When we come back, we'll hear how the Akron Roundtable is celebrating half a century of community dialogue and civic engagement. This is The Sound of Ideas. I'm Stephanie Haney. We'll be right back. You're with The Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thanks for staying with us. In today's fragmented and divisive political landscape, many find it more important than ever for communities to come together to have open conversations about the issues affecting their neighborhoods, including topics of global, national, and regional importance. The Akron Roundtable has been promoting this kind of collective dialogue for the past 50 years, ever since it was established in 1976. To date, it has hosted nearly 480 speakers from a variety of fields. Here to talk more about its history and how it's celebrating 50 years of public forums is the president of the Akron Roundtable, Curtis Minter Jr., calling in today. Curtis, thanks for being here.
Good morning, Stephanie. Thank you for having me.
If you want to be a part of this conversation, you can give us a call at 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org or message us on Instagram. We're at The Sound of Ideas. Curtis, as we mentioned, the Akron Roundtable is celebrating its 50th anniversary. So can you share the story behind its founding and what inspired this organization into existence?
For sure. So Akron Roundtable, some might argue, is a legacy organization, and I think its history proves its commitment to the city of Akron and surrounding areas. Some might even argue that its actual beginning came about in 1973, and so I'd like to highlight Kiwanis Club of Akron, who is very much integral to our origin story.
I want to make sure we still have Curtis with us. I think we may have a technical difficulty. The audio may have dropped out there. So while we wait to make sure that we have Curtis connected, we do have another guest joining us today. We have Brian Windhurst. He's the senior NBA reporter at ESPN and also tomorrow's speaker at the Akron Roundtable. Brian, do we have you with us?
Yes, good morning.
Brian, thank you so much for calling in today here on The Sound of Ideas. So our audience might be familiar with your early career at the Akron Beacon Journal and the Plain Dealer here in Northeast Ohio. Give us a quick rundown of your career and what you're up to right now.
Well, when I was in high school at St. Vincent St. Mary in Akron, I actually, every single month when the roundtable happened, a group of students would get to go to it. And so, I'm sad to say it's my 30th high school year that I graduated 30 years ago, 1996. So,
congratulations. Better than the alternative, Brian.
That's true. So I definitely, the roundtable has been something that was a part of my schooling. I got to go several times while I was in high school. and I believe they still have programs where they let high school students come to it. So I'm sort of a quote unquote graduate of experiencing that. So coming back 30 years later and being a speaker is one of the reasons why I cleared time to be able to come back here. Yes, I graduated from Kent State in 2000, and I began covering sports. I began covering the NBA in 2003, which coincided with LeBron James's arrival in Cleveland. And this is now my 23rd year covering the NBA. I worked at the Akron Beacon Journal and the Cleveland Plain Dealer. And for the last 15 years, I've been at ESPN, where I've had a great opportunity to chronicle not only LeBron's career, but a fascinating era in the NBA. And also the national team, which is one of the more rewarding things I've done, is covered the national team, covered the past few Olympic Games, for example. So, 23 years in, I'm just old enough to have seen enough and have some gray hair to have some perspective, but not quite a stick in the mud yet. I'm working on my stick in the mud credentials. Hopefully I'll get there one day.
Among the many credentials that you have from covering all of those events, certainly, Brian. Now, I want to let our audience know, if you're just joining us here on The Sound of Ideas, we're talking about the Akron Roundtable and its speaker series. Brian Windhorst, who is a senior NBA reporter at ESPN but hails from the Akron area, is the guest tomorrow. The number is 866-578-0903 if you want to call in with a comment or a question for Brian or about the Akron Roundtable in general. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org. Now, Brian, you talked about being involved as a young person with the Akron Roundtable. Where did your love of the game come from that led you to cover sports?
My mother was a very successful coach, a softball coach in Akron, and I was involved with her teams, keeping the scorebook and things. I was not an accomplished athlete. It was very clear to me early on that I was not going to be making it in the athletic field, but I was heavily involved in. I was very interested in it, and I was looking for a way to really be involved in the sports world. And the one thing that I've really become passionate about is storytelling. And when you look at it, when you talk about basketball, what you're doing is you're putting a round ball through a round ring, right? I mean, it's a very, very basic concept. What makes it so fascinating and engages millions of people across the country and hundreds of millions across the globe is the stories that come along with that. The stories of the games themselves, the stories of the players involved and the coaches involved in the game. And when it comes to the NBA, there's a huge fascination with team building and things that happen to put the teams together to win or lose, to triumph or fall apart. And, you can't have a game every day, every hour of every day. And so the fascination about what goes into that is what I've really devoted my career to. And really, it's just storytelling. And, in modern media, there's many different ways to tell stories. Sometimes you tell stories with audio. Sometimes you tell stories with video, with the written word. And that's what I've really spent a lot of my career doing is, telling stories about, sports, specifically basketball, and enriching it for the people who follow it and love the game.
We have Curtis Minter Jr. with us as well. He's the president of the Akron Roundtable. Curtis, welcome back to The Sound of Ideas.
Hello.
Curtis, I want to ask you, so we've heard a bit about Brian and his career and what led him to where he is today. When you think of guests that you're booking for the Akron Roundtable, and many of them that you have booked coming up on the 50th anniversary here, what are you looking for and what do you have coming up with the Akron Roundtable?
Yes, so in celebration of our 50th anniversary, the board of directors and staff set a theme. We wanted to pursue feature speakers who had local roots with a global reach. And so in doing that, we secured an all-star lineup that we're really excited about. Not only do we have Brian Windhorst tomorrow, but we'll also have Oscar award-winning Paul Tazewell, and many, many, many others. This is often deliberated by our working board of nearly 30-plus members. And so a lot of effort goes into deciding who we might bring in. It's such a dynamic board that we have a variety of folks representing different businesses, organizations, et cetera, who, keep their ears to what is going on in the city of Akron. And so we try to relay that in our selection process to bring folks who can speak to the times.
And Curtis, how would you describe the core mission of the Akron Roundtable?
Our mission has been and will be to inspire and promote community dialogue and networking by presenting speakers who inform and educate listeners on diverse topics of importance to the region, the nation, and the world.
Brian, let's talk a bit about your work now and how it ties here to Northeast Ohio. You've written several books about LeBron James' career, King James, as he's referred to. What's the most surprising or maybe unexpected piece of information that he shared with you that you've then been able to share it with others?
His career has been so long. He's now in his 23rd season. And I think it's not one thing about LeBron's career, it's about the breadth of it. And one of the things that is a robust conversation across the sports landscape is where LeBron's his career achievements rank all time. This is one of the things that engages so many people. And it's fascinating to me because no matter where I go, in the country or across the world, I've had the opportunity to cover LeBron and basketball on 5 continents, and I have these memories of him playing in London and him playing in Paris and him playing in Rio de Janeiro, and the conversation is often the same: is this the greatest player of all time or the second greatest player of all time? And while people love having that conversation, people love taking a position and defending it, whether it's against him or for him. I think it's really illustrative of just how far he has ascended in his career, that he is now basically no longer compared to the peers that he plays against on the court night in and night out, but compared to peers who he never played against. And really, while there's a joy and sometimes an argument that emerges from it, really is an illustration of how he has elevated himself sort of to status that almost no athletes are able to do. And so chronicling that, giving that perspective, I think this is the 10th anniversary of the championship that LeBron led the Cavs to in 2016, which, in my role at ESPN, I get to cover the championship run every single year. So I spend 2 months I spend 6 months chronicling each season, but then 2 months chronicling the playoffs. And so I'm side by side as these teams go through that journey, the 4 rounds of playoffs, and I experience being in these cities every year as their teams win. And so I have a perspective. And, people could say that it's because I'm from Northeast Ohio, and I'm sure that colors it to a certain extent. But that experience of 2016, of the comebacks that LeBron and the Cavs executed down 3-1 in that series against the Golden State Warriors, no team has ever come back from down 3-1. And the way the city embraced it is truly a unique thing. And one of the things that I attempt to do as I, in my role, is try to put things in perspective. And that accomplishment continues to be, it ages like wine, in all honesty, as we see how LeBron's career has gone on, and we see other teams, rise and fall. And so that, I think it's, that experience and what that meant for this community and what that meant for, the memories of so many sports fans is incredibly special. And of all the things he's accomplished, I've been there when he's gotten all kinds of trophies and all kinds of awards across the planet. Nothing will compare to that accomplishment. And
Brian, I want to ask you quickly as we start to wrap things up here. What do you think about James Harden, the beard? It would be really poetic for the Cavs to make a playoff run. What do you think the chances are?
Yeah, so they're in a very good position. They've won 12 of their last 14 games coming into the All-Star break. And the Eastern Conference that they play in is very, very wide open this year. Any 4 or 5 teams can win it. So for the Cavs to make a mid-season trade to add a future Hall of Famer certainly increases their chances. That said, I think it's going to be a tough run. They've got a chance, but it's going to take good health and some good fortune.
We know we saw LeBron say that, of course, aside from the Lakers, he feels good about the Cavaliers. So that's always nice to hear, that ringing endorsement from LeBron James. Curtis, our last question to you. We know that Brian is the speaker coming up on the Akron Round Table. What do people need to know about that event?
Yes, so definitely can find more details as it concerns our signature luncheon tomorrow featuring Brian at akronroundtable.org. There you can purchase tickets. We also have bundle packages available for the remainder of the year where you can secure 4 or 6 luncheons of your own.
All right, Curtis, thank you very much for sharing that with us. Thank you to our guests, Curtis Minter Jr. and Brian Windhurst. We appreciate the time. That wraps up our show for today. If you missed any part of today's show, you can hear a rebroadcast tonight at 9 on 89.7 WKSU, and you can catch every episode of The Sound of Ideas on demand wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. To get the last word on today's topics, send us an email at soi@ideastream.org or comment on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. Tomorrow on the show, fish fry season is here, so we'll bring you The Menu, our bi-weekly series all across Northeast Ohio's food scene in partnership with Cleveland Magazine on fish fries. And a quick announcement, join us at the next Sound of Ideas community tour. That is Wednesday, March 4th at 6 p.m. at the Burke Lakefront Airport. We're talking about the future of the airport and the city's efforts to expand that lakefront development. It's free. You just need to register at ideastream.org/SOI. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thanks for keeping the conversation going. We'll see you tomorrow here on The Sound of Ideas.